I am is a one-trick pony, and I guess all my work has been around this issue over the last 10 years. And what we've tried to do is spend, I guess, time codifying what an effective approach to addressing disadvantage looks like, both at at a system level, at a school level, and a classroom level. And I would argue that, and I guess it's trying to take what is an exceptionally complex and challenging issue and make it accessible and implementable. I know that's not really a word in schools and classrooms. I would argue strongly that we address the macro issues around the underachievement of our disadvantaged pupils by focusing on the micro issues, and to consider that every single one of our interactions with our disadvantaged pupils are fundamental to their better outcomes. We don't solve educational disadvantage with big shiny interventions and things like that, whilst they have their place. It's the quality of the learning experience our pupils have, in the classroom that matters most. That sense of belonging in wider school life too. Now, address it. By the way, just so any questions that you have, just I don't know if colleagues can put them in the chat, or you can do shout them out, and I'll try and address them. But addressing educational disadvantage is difficult. It's challenging, and it just got more difficult, didn't it? Over the last year, and those sort of partial school closures that we've seen, and the challenges that have arisen from that show that I guess that endemic inequality that exists in our society. But we're not powerless on this agenda either, and there are strategic and operational adjustments that we can make that can raise the attainment of our disadvantaged pupils if we focus on what's in our gift and what's in our influence, and that is the quality of the learning experience our disadvantaged pupils have day in, day out, week in, week out, sort of term in, term out. As I said a little bit earlier, every interaction matters. And we have to avoid some of the hyperbole there's been about lost learning, I think, around disadvantaged pupils and lockdown. Some of it is not that helpful at all in terms of how we respond to pupil need, but I'll talk about that in a little further on. But my starting point for all of this is that we have to believe that our disadvantaged pupils can attain well. Belief on its own isn't enough, but actually, if we don't have that belief that our pupils can, from less affluent backgrounds, can attain well, what we start to do is blame pupils or indeed their families for their underachievement, rather than take ownership of it ourselves. So that sense of that we believe that those pupils can do well is super important. It's worth remembering, as ever, that children, pupils. Sorry, this is a bit. So I'm just talking about the sort of the research that underpins this work. Now, it feels a bit Gilderoy Lockhart sharing these studies with you, so forgive me. But they are rooted in, I guess, 10 years of work, and hearing the voices of teachers and schools and school leaders as to how best we go about tackling this entrenched issue. But I think it's worth saying at the start that pupils are not at risk of underachievement because they're pupil premium, or indeed any other label that might be attached to them. They're at risk of underachievement because of the impact of socioeconomic disadvantage on their learning over time. And that is a process, not an event. In many cases, it's something that starts prenatal. It's a long-term issue which warrants a long-term response. And in schools that we find that are most effective at addressing educational disadvantage, we see a collective understanding of how disadvantage impacts on pupils' learning. We see a collective response in terms of how we can negate the worst effects of that. And within that collective response, individuals understand what their roles are within addressing disadvantage. This work in Oldham and Derby, this study that we did around government opportunity areas, those social mobility cold spots, we looked at what was happening in schools that were performing well by the disadvantaged pupils and what was happening in those schools that were struggling. There was very little difference in those schools around the types of activity they were undertaking. The things that defined the schools that were struggling was trying to do too many things at once, and the leadership of addressing disadvantage sitting with one or two people. And what happened then was when there were changes in staffing, the baton was dropped. The leadership of addressing disadvantage was being passed around the schools like pass the parcel and infant party. Whereas schools that we found that were performing well, there was a collective ownership for the strategy, a collective responsibility, and then individuals, whether you're a subject leader, a year group leader, a member of the pastoral team, understanding what your role is within the strategy. So I would argue that schools that are most effective at addressing disadvantage give teachers and support staff the capacity, the expertise, the knowledge, the professional development to be able to meet the needs of their pupils in their school community, and it's very much context specific. In the most recent publication, we've tried to, I guess, distill some really important principles, some recommendations about how schools can best address disadvantage. Firstly, around getting it right in terms of culture, values, expectations, relationships. Relationships are at the heart of an effective strategy. That a strategy is driven by assessment, not assumptions about pupils, and that we understand how socioeconomic disadvantage impacts on the classroom. Then we take that a tiered approach around negating the impact of disadvantage on learning through teaching and learning, academic intervention, wider approaches, and also the importance of implementation and impact evaluation too. And I'll try and get to all of these in the next 22 minutes or so. Our strategies must be underpinned by research evidence, but also that we're an outward-facing school and an outward-facing classroom, and we draw on wider support as well. Pupil premium as a policy hasn't always worked in our schools for a couple of reasons. Firstly, at times we've been driven by accountability rather than the needs of pupils. So we've done things that are easy to evidence that we've done or easy to implement, rather than the things that we know really that are more complex and nuanced, but will actually make a difference for pupils in the long term. And sometimes we've done things for pupils because they're pupil premium, rather than addressing the underlying need. And what those things both do is inadvertently they can isolate pupils from their peers, and they can de-emphasize teaching. And teaching and learning remains our best lever for addressing these issues. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about high expectations. High expectations are fundamental, but it's for addressing disadvantage. But it's a pretty nebulous thing, isn't it? It's difficult to imagine going into any school or any classroom and colleagues saying, well, I've got low expectations of my disadvantaged pupils. So we need to have it's not for me to define what high expectations are, but we do need to have some sort of collective understanding around this. And I do worry around the sort of, the pupil premium monster that we've created in our schools at times, around some of the subconscious biases that come with labelling pupils. In the primary phase, I think there's something really, really important about curriculum equity. And we have a challenge really around the tyranny of intervention, I guess. And what we have, if we're not careful, is that we have our pupils from the most who have the broadest vistas outside of school, the most sort of social, cultural, financial capital, the richest experiences beyond school, having the richest curriculum offer in our schools as well. And our more disadvantaged pupils, particularly those with a lower prior attainment profile, in a cycle of interventions, missing out on the foundation subjects. And every one of those foundation subject lessons is a language development, language comprehension moment. We miss some of the most really valuable informal aspects of school life that we're really, really missing at the moment, aren't we? And And then we have the Matthew effect going on in our classrooms, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So those that have the richest, the most enrichment outside of school, getting the broadest curriculum offer in school. Now, there's not a number or a formula to apply to this, but we need to be thinking carefully around curriculum equity and whether well-intentioned interventions are really bearing the fruit that we'd like them to. I also think that it's absolutely it's really, really important that we're scaffolding up rather than differentiating down, setting pupils sort of easier work rather than using scaffolding, modelling and partially worked examples, giving pupils easier work, one chilly activity, almost some activities, set limits on what pupils can achieve. And I know a great friend of yours, Dame Alison Peacock at the school, her work really has been fundamental in sort of tackling this issue. So it's got to be teacher expertise and scaffolding up rather than differentiating down, because if we give pupils easier work based on the table they're sitting on or their prior attainment, we set limits on what those children can achieve. And it's these little moments that go towards addressing disadvantage. These little classroom interactions, these decisions that we make day in, day out, make all the difference to our disadvantaged pupils. I'd also, if I was in charge of the world, I'm not in charge of anything, but again, linked to Dame Alison's work, I would ban the language of low ability in our classrooms and ability labelling. Again, it sets limits on what children can achieve. And it can also influence our own sort of subconscious biases that we think, oh, Marc, he's low ability, doesn't read very much at home. We might subconsciously just expect a little bit less of me in lessons. We might expect me to speak a little bit less. We might expect me to write a little bit less. We might expect me to contribute a little bit less. And again, over a child's school career, those interactions can set limits on what pupils can achieve. So understanding pupil need is fundamental to addressing educational disadvantage. And this is the key question that we need to be asking. Not what are the barriers for our pupil premium children, but how does socioeconomic disadvantage impact on pupils' learning? And then how are we going to respond to it through that tiered model, teaching and learning, academic intervention and wider approaches. Poorly identified pupil need is one of the biggest challenges for our disadvantaged pupils. It's got to be assessment, not assumptions, that drives our strategy and our activity. Pupil need, not labels. Poorly identified pupil need leads to poorly identified activity, leads to weaker outcomes for pupils despite all the efforts that we might put in, and it can lead to initiative fatigue or a cynicism around disadvantage. And what we end up then with is the supermarket sweep approach to disadvantage, grabbing hold of different interventions and hoping that one of them might stick. Whereas that robust assessment of need can really facilitate early intervention, addressing issues as early as possible. And early intervention is a fundamental principle here, because what it does, the earlier that we intervene to address issues, the better we give our disadvantaged pupils a chance of really thriving and enjoying school. And I think everybody should have the opportunity to enjoy school, irrespective of background and barrier to learning. So when I talk about assessment, I'm talking about diagnostic assessment, academic and pastoral, but observations of children's learning behaviours, their social interactions, pupil voice, but also listening to teacher voice as well, and indeed support staff voice too, that our strategies and our approaches to disadvantage should be rooted in the voices of the classroom. Teacher agency is fundamental importance in this, but it's got to be assessment, not assumptions, and there are too many assumptions made around our disadvantaged pupils, often driven by that label. Look, really, really briefly, I don't want to spend too much time talking about COVID-19, but I point you towards a couple of resources. Firstly, the Impact Ed study. So it's a longitudinal study looking at the experiences of 60,000 pupils across the country and the impact of partial school closures on their learning and indeed their well-being. The findings are really, really interesting. Firstly, the least surprising thing that you'll hear all year, that pupils with special educational needs and those that were most disadvantaged found the greatest difficulties. But interestingly, those difficulties were not primarily associated with a lack of ICT. That's not to say that there wasn't a lack of ICT, but they weren't the greatest challenges. The greatest challenge was around a lack of space and a quiet place to work at home. But also the stress and anxiety associated with income insecurity, also cited as some of the biggest challenges. And this is where I think it gets really, really interesting and why school matters. That the other challenges were missing the lack of social interaction, the importance of relationships with teachers and peers, the lack of structure and routine, consistency of expectations and opportunities for conversations and discussions, feedback on learning. Now, whilst it's hot, those are quite sad things to read and learn about, it's also really exciting because it tells us the power of school and about the power of classrooms and the power of social interaction for all children, but particularly for our most disadvantaged learners too. I'd really, really commend to you the work of the British Psychological Society around using psychological perspectives to support re-engagement as well. And I think for me, we have to, the Impact Ed study as well provides a really, really high quality, a sort of academically validated approach to diagnostic assessment around children's well-being, their metacognition and their anxiety as well. You can access it by the link on the previous slide. So I'd really, really commend this to you so we can understand what's happened in our own schools. But for me, we need to lose the language of catch-up and the hyperbole around £40,000 of lost income and 500 years to close the gap, all of those kinds of things, because they're not useful to us in the classroom tomorrow. For me, I think we need to be focusing on these 3 R's. This restoration into school life, resecuring relationships and responding to need. It's got to be assessment that drives our response to COVID-19 and not assumptions. And in particular, ensuring that our teachers and support staff have that real expertise around formative assessment, that we can carry on that ongoing assessment of children's learning needs. One of the biggest things we need to avoid is chucking the kitchen sink at these children in terms of interventions and the like. It's relationships that will drive our strategies to address disadvantage. And I wish I'd written. I wish I'd written these paragraphs here. They're not mine, sadly. But my colleague Margaret Mulholland, who's an inclusion expert at ASCO, talks about we don't need our teachers and our support staff to be experts in pupil premium. We don't need teachers to be experts in all these different diagnostic labels that we have in special educational needs. We need our teachers and our support staff to be expert in the children in front of them. And I think that's really, really empowering in terms of how we approach this issue. We need to be experts in our children. Our strategies to address disadvantage will stand or fall on the quality of the relationships that we forge. We'll not address educational disadvantage by ratcheting up accountability and telling people what to do. In fact, that actually absolves people of accountability, doesn't it? And Osher et al. Summarise this beautifully here. When I talk about relationships, I'm talking about relationships between adults and pupils, of course. I'm talking about relationships between adults and how we collectively work together on this agenda. I'm talking about relationships between pupils and the power of social interaction. And ultimately, we want our disadvantaged pupils, don't we? Need all pupils to have a better relationship with learning. That is at the key. That's at the heart of an effective strategy, that we improve pupils as learners. And the more I know, the more I'll want to know. And it broadens my background knowledge, the glue that makes learning stick. But it's founded on good relationships. For me, the language gap is the attainment gap. This is a seminal study, Walfogel and Washbrook, low income and early cognitive development, and picking out this sort of correlation between low levels of low income low levels of language, higher levels of sort of conduct and hyperactivity difficulties. This for me is the terrible 2s, terrible 5s, terrible 11s, terrible 16s, and I think we have to think carefully as we reintegrate after partial school closures around those pupils that struggle with language to express their experiences. But this language gap, coupled with a social isolation gap that many of our disadvantaged pupils sort of experience, is the attainment gap. And we know that poor oral language in particular is a significant anchor on future attainment. And I think one of the biggest challenges for our disadvantaged pupils in our classrooms is that presumption of language. When I struggle with language comprehension, my lessons become something to get through rather than participate in. I'm clinging on to my lessons, and we might see things like desktop truancy, keeping my head down and hoping that nobody will notice, just to get through, or waiting and listening for the answer from someone else and then writing it down in my books. But actually, that's a scary place to be when you're on the margins of the lesson. Good oral language, good language comprehension associated with high levels of self-esteem, higher levels of self-confidence, better attention, better contributions in lessons. If we can get this right, we get pretty much everything else that we do in school, give it a better chance of success. And I think if there's one thing to take away from this talk, in terms of how reflecting on our practices, it's to be thinking about who is talking in our classrooms. Is it those pupils with well-developed oral language who are articulate, who have good background knowledge, good oracy, good articulacy? Or are we providing through our planning and our teaching those opportunities for pupils with less well-developed language to be talking to? Because again, otherwise we have the Matthew effect in our classrooms, don't we? Where the rich getting richer, the pupils doing all the talking are those that are well practiced in talking, whereas those that perhaps have lower levels of language or are less confident, on the margins of discussions. I'd also really commend to you the work of Isabel Beck and her colleagues around bringing words to life. This Chartered College article around deepening knowledge through vocabulary learning, I think, is one of the most sort of valuable sort of articles that I've ever come across around. We don't address the language gap through word walls and vocabulary mats. It's about meaningful interactions with language. Multiple encounters with language in using children-friendly definitions and exciting examples of the use of language, rewarding children for their use of that language. To summarize decades of complex research, it's conversation, not word exposure, that builds children's language and literacy. And linked to that, so this is the Millennium Cohort study, and around where we need to be wary, I think, around research evidence and how it informs sort of our approaches. So it's super interesting sort of research, this for me, that children who read broadly and deeply have a better vocabulary than those that don't. Again, not particularly surprising things for you to hear. But what we know from this work is that even when we control for, sort of taking account for other factors like background, socioeconomic groups that we've grown up in, children who read more broadly do better in vocabulary test scores. So reading broadly really has the potential to overcome some of the challenges associated with growing up on a low income. But it's worth remembering that the research evidence around reading for pleasure is pretty complex. And again, to oversimplify things within the context of a short discussion, I'm unlikely to read for pleasure if I really struggle to read. If I'm struggling with decoding, I don't have any working memory to, for comprehension. Reading is a real slog for me, and I'm unlikely to read for pleasure if I've struggled to learn to read, which again is why school really matters for our most disadvantaged pupils. It has the power to be transformative, particularly in that pivotal time between sort of learning to read and reading to learn. So what we do in the classroom really matters on this agenda, as does pupils' perceptions of themselves as learners. For natural history experts in the room, this is a harvest mouse, and the language that we use around learning is really, really important here. So when we were doing some work in South Gloucestershire a couple of years ago, we were in a classroom, and it was Black History Month, and the teacher put a picture of Rosa Parks on the board, and asked the students, does anybody know who this is? And a pupil stood up and just gave the most wonderful biography of Rosa Parks you could wish to hear. Who she was, why she chose what to do, what she did, what the legacy of it was, what the impact, and just wonderful, wonderful thing to hear. And at the end of the input, the teacher said to the pupil, so the children in the class, well done, Luke, thank you very much. Now we all know about Rosa Parks. And what we needed to ask there was Luke how he knew about Rosa Parks. And he might have said, well, I read the Rebel Girls book, then I watched a TV documentary about Rosa Parks, and then I read some more. And the more I knew, the more I wanted to find out. Because if we don't ask how the pupil knows those things, those pupils, without that background knowledge, think that Luke is just, the pupil's name wasn't Luke, by the way, thinks Luke is magically clever. He just knows those things. Whereas actually, to acquire that knowledge, Luke has planned, he's monitored, and he's evaluated his own learning. And our most proficient learners have those skills, and evidence tells us that we explicitly teach pupils how to plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. It can have a significant impact on their outcomes. And my colleague Andy Brumby from the Cornwall Research School links the harvest mouse. He says, don't just celebrate the harvest, the answer, but celebrate the ploughing, the planting, the weeding, and the pruning that gets you to that answer. Because if we just say, well done, Luke, now we all know this, we think that pupil, if we don't have that knowledge, we think that Luke is magically clever. He just knows those things, and he doesn't. He's acquired that language, that knowledge through effort. And we can all acquire that knowledge. Okay, my last slide, and then I will stop. I'm running out of time. This is an awful slide to present to, but I think it's worth sort of sharing all the same, just about bias. And I've talked about the problems with labelling pupils and how that can set limits on what they can achieve. Bias exists within our society, and it's part of a natural human response. I'd really commend you thinking fast, and slow around this. The biases and our bias is part of our lived experiences. We did some super interesting work with teachers in Cornwall, asking them, what's the first thing you think about when I say special educational needs? What's the first thing you think about when I say pupil premium? What's the first thing I think about, when I say free school meals? And colleagues were super open about it. And they said the automatic association with this and low attainment. And that subconscious bias risks setting limits on what pupils can achieve. They also talk really interestingly about how they had some biases against surnames as well. I've got another Rowland. His sister didn't work very hard either. She sort of found it difficult to engage with school life. It's another Rowland. And how those things risk, again, through a subconscious bias, and it picks up here how it can impact on teacher assessment, more important than ever at the moment, isn't it, around GCSE results. But it also impacts on things like feedback. So feedback, for example, is a highly relational transaction. And if we're not careful, feedback is something like it becomes a gap widener rather than something that closes the gap, because actually those pupils that are most confident about their learning are soaking up feedback all the time, aren't they? Whereas those that have negative perceptions of themselves as learners, who are less confident, will be shying away from that feedback, and it can be like treading on eggshells at times, which is why we need a pupil-led response to things like feedback rather than a provision-led response, where we meet the needs of the pupil rather than the needs of the policy. Because otherwise, if we do everything the same, then actually what we do becomes a gap widener, and those things work for the most confident pupils, but they're less effective for those who are less confident, who are less secure in their relationships. If we think bias doesn't exist in our system, we just need to look at the work of Professor Becky Francis and her grouping study. So it's a qualitative study looking at setting in Key Stage 3 in secondary schools. Becky's study found that pupils of Black Caribbean heritage, on average, are set 2 sets lower than what their current attainment says they should be. So this bias exists in our society, and the best way that we can address it, we can't get rid of it, but we can control it by getting those discussions out in the open and considering whether we hold on to any of those. But it's fundamental to addressing this pupil premium monster that I think that we've created.